I placed the keys to the brand new truck in my father's hand, the restaurant lights blessing its silver paint. He raised his glass, then announced my department was being dissolved for wastefulness. My position, he declared, now belonged to my brother. Everyone laughed nervously. I didn't, because the truck I bought tonight, and the name on the invoice, was the thread that would unravel the comfortable lies he stood upon. My name is Nora Whitlow. At 31, I am the head of vendor risk for Kingsley and Bray Logistics, a title that sounds important because it is. My job is to be the gatekeeper, the analyst who ensures that every contractor, every supplier, every single truck that moves our cargo is ironclad in its compliance and integrity. I live by the fine print. Tonight, however, was not about the fine print. It was about grand gestures. We were seated in the Fairhaven Room, the premier dining space at Hallow Creek's most expensive restaurant. The light was the color of pale, aged whiskey, casting soft glows on the starched white tablecloths that felt like brittle paper to the touch. The air was thick with the scent of seared steak and old money. It was a celebration for my father, Graham Whitlow, a man turning 60 who commanded a room as easily as he commanded the fleet at Stonecross Freight. As the chief operating officer of our largest regional contractor, he was a titan in our small world, a man whose presence was a gravitational force. Around the table sat the architecture of his life. My stepmother, Darla, her diamonds catching the light with every practiced turn of her wrist. My older brother, Cole, who had his father's build, but none of his sharp-edged focus. His smile always a little too loose. A few of Dad's senior colleagues from Stonecross were there. Men with weathered faces and expensive watches, their laughter a low, rumbling bass line to the evening score. I waited until the main courses had been cleared and the dessert menus were being distributed. I had rehearsed this moment. From my purse, I pulled a small, heavy box wrapped in simple navy paper. I slid it across the table. "Happy birthday, Dad." He feigned surprise, a skill he'd mastered in boardrooms and at family dinners. He unwrapped it with a theatrical slowness, revealing the key fob. It was for a brand new North Star Titan 2500, fully loaded, in celestial silver, the exact truck he'd been circling in catalogs for months. "Nora," he breathed, his voice thick with what I, for a moment, allowed myself to believe was genuine emotion. "You shouldn't have." "Just press the unlock button," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He aimed it toward the large windows overlooking the parking lot. A sharp, clean beep-beep cut through the murmur of the restaurant, followed by the flash of headlights. Outside, parked in the space reserved for the restaurant owner, the truck gleamed under the valet lights. It was a monument of chrome and steel, a promise of power and freedom. A collective gasp went around the table. The Stonecross men whistled in appreciation. Cole just stared, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth. My father stood, his eyes shining. He held the key fob up like a trophy. Then he picked up his crystal glass of Cabernet, the wine a deep, dark red inside. The clinking of a spoon against glass silenced the table. He was about to give a speech. "Thank you, all of you, for being here," he began, his voice resonant, filling the space. "To my team, my friends, and my family. At the end of the day, family is all that matters. It's the bedrock, the foundation on which we build everything else." He paused, looking around the table, his gaze lingering on me for a fraction of a second too long. There was a current underneath the warmth, a cold undertow I was only just beginning to feel. He took a sip of wine. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted. It was no longer the grateful patriarch, but the COO of Stonecross Freight. It was the voice he used for quarterly earnings calls and contract negotiations. And in business, as in family, sometimes you have to make hard decisions for the greater good. You have to trim the fat, streamline operations. My breath caught in my throat. I felt a chill spread from the base of my spine. This was not a birthday speech. This was a press release. "To that end," he continued, his eyes now fixed directly on me, a cold, predatory glint in them. I have it on good authority that starting this Monday, Kingsley and Bray will be making some much-needed structural changes. They're cutting a redundant department, one that has become, shall we say, more focused on abstract risk than concrete results. The silence at the table was no longer respectful. It was thick, suffocating. The smell of burnt sugar from a nearby was suddenly nauseating. "We need doers in this business, not graders," he said, the words landing like stones. He turned his smile toward my brother. "Which is why I'm proud to announce that they've created a new role. Someone to act as a special advisor on contract risk, coordinating directly with key partners like us. And I couldn't be prouder that my son, Cole, will be stepping into that role." A ripple of confused, obligatory applause went around the table. The Stonecross men, loyal soldiers, clapped uncertainly. Cole, bless his simple heart, beamed. A puppet who didn't even realize his strings were being pulled by the man standing next to him. Through the haze, I heard Darla let out a high, tinkling laugh. "A new era," she chirped to the woman beside her, her voice dripping with saccharine victory. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I felt the blood drain from my face, leaving my skin cold and tight. My entire career, the department I had built from the ground up, the protocols I had written, the team I had trained, erased, and my position, my very identity within the company I had dedicated my life to, handed to my brother like a party favor. My mind, trained to identify anomalies and trace them to their source, was already working, pushing past the shock, the searing humiliation. The decision hadn't been announced. It wasn't even finalized. My boss was presenting the restructuring plan to the board on Friday. Today was Tuesday. I picked up my water glass, my hand perfectly steady. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The ice clinked softly against the crystal. I set it down without a sound. When I looked at my father, my voice was low and devoid of any emotion. It was the voice of Nora Whitlow, head of vendor risk. "Who told you about an unannounced internal decision, Dad?" The question hung in the air, a surgical probe seeking the source of a data breach. The faint smiles on the faces of his colleagues faltered. This wasn't a family drama anymore. This was a question of corporate espionage. Graham's smile didn't waver. He was enjoying this, the public display of his power over me, over my company. He gave me a slow, paternal wink, a gesture of absolute dominance. "Good news travels fast, sweetheart." That was his mistake, the condescension, the belief that he had won so completely that he could afford to gloat. He saw a daughter he had just broken. He didn't see the auditor standing in the wreckage, already running the numbers. I looked down at the key fob, still resting by his plate next to a smear of béarnaise sauce. The silver North Star logo seemed to mock me. A gift, a sacrifice, a tool of my own execution. Slowly, I reached out and picked it up. The cool plastic felt heavy, solid, real. I held it for a moment, then placed it deliberately in the center of the table, on the pristine white linen between the salt shaker and the floral centerpiece. It lay there like a piece of evidence. I met my father's triumphant gaze. My voice was a whisper, but it carried across the silent table with the force of a gunshot. "So do invoices." The drive home from the restaurant was a silent, controlled burn. My hands were steady on the wheel, my eyes fixed on the rain-slicked asphalt of Hallow Creek's empty streets. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't cry. My mind, a machine built for analysis, was replaying the dinner not as a memory, but as a deposition. Graham's triumphant smile, the way Darla's rings sparkled as she raised her glass to toast my demise. Cole's vacant, pleased expression. Each detail was an exhibit, logged and categorized. Family, my father had said, is a bedrock, but he was wrong. Family is a contract, an unwritten, unspoken agreement with clauses that shift and change without notice. Growing up in our modest house on Candle Row, a neighborhood of identical homes and manicured lawns, my father's gospel was the sanctity of the written word. He'd spread his own contracts out on the kitchen table, the dense blocks of text illuminated by the cheap overhead light. "Nora," he'd say, tapping a long paragraph with his forefinger, "the devil isn't in the details. The devil is the details. You read every contract to the last line, or you'll spend your life paying for someone else's signature." He taught me the lesson, but he never gave me the textbook. I was allowed to watch, to absorb the theory, but I was never permitted to touch his work. His Stonecross files were kept in a locked briefcase. When I'd ask what he was working on, he'd smile that same paternal smile from the restaurant. "Nothing for you to worry your pretty head about." Cole, however, was given the keys to the kingdom. While I was learning to dissect legalese, Cole was learning to double clutch in the cab of a semi. He was given every opportunity that involved dirt and diesel, every chance to be a miniature version of Graham Whitlow. My path, as my father decreed it, was different. "You work in an office, Nora. It's clean. It's safe." He said it like he was protecting me, but what he was really doing was building a fence. He was defining my jurisdiction, keeping me out of his. So I built my own kingdom. While Cole was getting grease under his fingernails on his father's payroll, I was paying for night classes at the community college with my waitressing tips. I devoured textbooks on corporate finance, supply chain management, and regulatory compliance. I didn't get a graduation party. I got an unpaid internship in the newly formed vendor risk department at Kingsley and Bray Logistics. I wasn't the Ivy League candidate. I was the one who worked harder, stayed later, and read every single file to the last line. I found loopholes no one else saw. I flagged risks everyone else missed. I was good at it. I was precise. And I rose, rung by painful rung, until I was the one running the department. Then came the change. 4 years ago, Kingsley and Bray put its regional freight contract up for bid. It was the largest account in the territory. Stonecross, under my father's operational leadership, won it. On the surface, it was a clean win. Their bid was competitive. Their fleet was modern. I recused myself from the final vote, citing the obvious conflict of interest, a move my own boss praised as a model of integrity. But after the ink was dry, things began to shift in subtle ways. My father, who had never shown the slightest interest in the internal politics of my clean office job, suddenly had an uncanny insight into them. A manager in another department would casually mention a suggestion from Graham about optimizing a delivery route, a suggestion that happened to benefit Stonecross. An internal audit on fuel cost adjustments would be subtly redirected away from his fleet. His name was never on the meeting invitations, but his voice began to echo in the conference rooms. He had a strange, phantom authority, a shareholder's influence without owning a single share. At home, the dynamic solidified. Darla, who measured a person's worth by their proximity to power, began referring to me with a dismissive wave of her hand as the accountant daughter. It was a label meant to diminish, to separate. I dealt with paper. They dealt with the real world of trucks and torque. Cole was the one who can actually drive a truck, a phrase always delivered with a proud glance at my father. They built a narrative where my success was abstract and theirs was tangible. I was a cost center. They were the profit engine. What they never understood is that an accountant, at her core, is a historian of truth. I am by nature and by training, a keeper of records. They grew accustomed to my quiet observation, mistaking my silence for submission. They didn't know that after meetings where I felt my professional judgment was being subtly undermined by my father's invisible hand, I would go back to my desk and make a note, a date, a time, the contract number in question. When Cole was given a project manager title at Stonecross, and I noticed his signature appearing on invoices that were suspiciously close to the automatic approval threshold, I started a new ledger, in a password-protected file on my personal drive. I logged the license plate numbers of Stonecross trucks entering and leaving our main distribution center, cross-referencing them with their official maintenance logs. It was a habit, a professional reflex. I was auditing the world around me. They saw it as a character flaw. "Nora, you need to learn to trust people," Darla would say when I'd question a discrepancy. Family loyalty is everything, my father would remind me, usually when I was about to flag one of his shipments for a random compliance check. Their definition of loyalty was a gag order. It was a clause that demanded my silence, that required me to ignore the very principles my job, and my father himself, had taught me to uphold. Tonight, at that dinner, he had tried to write a new binding clause into our contract. The public humiliation, the destruction of my career, the elevation of my brother. It was meant to be the final word, the codicil that transferred all power and agency to him. The gift of the truck wasn't a peace offering. It was a severance package, a gleaming silver monument to my professional execution, paid for with my own money. He thought he was closing the book on Nora Whitlow, the accountant daughter. He thought he had finally, permanently, put me in my clean, safe office, which now happened to be my own apartment. He had miscalculated. He had forgotten his own lesson. He'd written a contract and assumed I wouldn't read the fine print. Sitting in the blue glow of my monitor, the city lights of Hallow Creek, a distant, blurry constellation, I decided it was time to review the terms. It was time to see what he had signed in my name. The shock from the restaurant had receded, replaced by an icy, methodical calm. This was my work. This was my area of expertise. I wasn't a daughter scorned. I was a risk manager who had just identified the single greatest threat to my organization, and it was sitting in my father's driveway. I opened the folder on my desktop labeled Dad's 60th. Inside was the sales agreement from Blackridge Motors. I had read it a dozen times before signing, of course, but I opened it again, my eyes scanning past the VIN, the total price, the financing terms. I was looking for the devil, and then I found it, a small, almost insignificant line item under the discounts and rebates section, a corporate fleet discount, standard enough, but the name of the entity receiving the rebate wasn't Stonecross Freight. It wasn't Kingsley and Bray. It was a name I had never seen before, a company that had no business being on a contract I had signed. Northline Fleet Services. And just like that, the audit began. The name sat on my screen, innocuous and sterile. Northline Fleet Services. It was the beginning of a thread, and my fingers were already tracing it. The invoice from Blackridge Motors was clear. Payment for the North Star Titan 2500 drawn from my personal account. I was the buyer. But the corporate rebate, a significant sum intended for businesses purchasing multiple vehicles, had been issued to Northline. My first step was instinct. I logged into Kingsley and Bray's vendor portal. My credentials still active, a ghost in the machine they hadn't yet exorcised. I ran a search. 0 results. Northline Fleet Services was not, and had never been, an approved contractor. They had no master service agreement, no insurance on file, no record of existence within the ecosystem I policed every single day. This wasn't a clerical error. This was a deliberate redirection of funds. A ghost entity had received a financial benefit tied to a transaction I initiated. The truck wasn't just a gift anymore. It was Exhibit A. My mind raced. The vehicle identification number, the VIN, was my next data point. Every vehicle has a unique digital fingerprint, a 16-character string that tells its story. I copied the VIN from the digital sales contract and pivoted to the fleet management software we use to track our contractors' assets for insurance and fuel card purposes. Stonecross Freight had its entire fleet logged in the system. I ran a search for the Titan's VIN. There it was, the brand new truck, the one I had paid for, was already listed in the Stonecross system. It had been added 3 days ago, preemptively, as part of a bulk purchase lot. According to the log, it was one of 7 vehicles acquired under a fleet expansion program, making it eligible for a substantial fuel rebate from the Regional Petroleum Consortium. My father had used my gift as the cornerstone for a much larger, more lucrative deception. The pieces began to click into place with the cold, satisfying precision of a lock tumbler. I pulled up the full acquisition manifest for the Stonecross fleet over the last 2 years, buried in the data. I found what I was looking for, a small, recurring pattern of single-vehicle acquisitions, always luxury models, always timed just before a larger bulk purchase of standard work trucks, a new sedan for Darla, a sports coupe for Cole, a top-of-the-line SUV that matched the one my father drove on weekends. Each one, I now suspected, was a family vehicle, privately enjoyed but officially bundled into the corporate fleet. They were using the company's purchasing power to get discounts, and then classifying the vehicles as business assets to write off maintenance, insurance, and fuel. It was a classic shell game, moving assets between personal and corporate columns to maximize benefits and minimize costs. But where did Northline fit in? The rebate from my truck was the key. If they were funneling rebates and benefits for all these vehicles, there had to be a money trail. I switched from the vendor portals to the public record. A search for Northline Fleet Services, LLC, in the state's corporate registry hit pay dirt. The company was registered 18 months ago. It was a single-member LLC. The filing address wasn't a garage or an office, but a PEO box at the Lakeside Postal Annex, a place people use when they don't want their mail delivered to their home. Anonymous, transient. The registered agent was a generic incorporation service, another layer of insulation. But the final page of the filing documents, the one that listed the beneficial owner, the person who actually reaped the profits, held the answer. There, in stark, black and white digital print, was the name, Darla Whitlow, 100% ownership. My stepmother, the woman who called me the accountant daughter, was the sole proprietor of a phantom fleet services company that was siphoning money from my father's corporate partner. The rage I should have felt was replaced by a surge of adrenaline, a chilling, clarifying focus. This was no longer just about my job. This was a conspiracy to defraud. The scheme needed an inside man at Stonecross to approve the paperwork, to add the vehicles to the fleet roster, to sign off on the routing of the rebates. I went back to the fleet management software, digging into the audit logs for the 7-vehicle purchase that included my truck. The digital signature on the final approval was time-stamped and logged. The user ID was simple: C. Whitlow. The title listed next to it was not his official one. Instead, it read, Special Projects. It was a catch-all designation, vague enough to avoid scrutiny, perfect for signing off on things that shouldn't be signed. My brother, the doer, was the rubber stamp. The entire mechanism was elegant in its simplicity. It exploited a single, mundane loophole in the system, a loophole I myself had flagged for review 6 months prior. The fleet tracking software cross-referenced vehicle registrations with insurance documents, but it relied on license plate numbers for the final verification. In our state, there was a 7-day grace period before a new vehicle's official plate number was entered into the DMV's central database. In that 1-week window, a vehicle could exist in the system with a temporary tag number. By adding the family vehicles to the fleet manifest during this grace period, they could assign them internal tracking numbers, qualify them for the bulk rebates, and then, once the official plates were issued, simply never update the record. The system would never flag a mismatch because it wasn't programmed to look for one after the initial entry. It was a blind spot, a deliberate, exploitable gap in the chain of custody. My mind flashed back, a rapid-fire sequence of previously insignificant moments, the times I had tried to do a spot check on the Stonecross yard. Sorry, Nora, the yard manager would say, my father's loyal lieutenant. Insurance regulations, active loading zone, it's for your own safety. The family barbecues where my father would proudly show off Darla's new car. Got a great deal through the company program, he'd boast. The way Cole would talk about special projects that kept him busy, a term I'd dismissed as him puffing up his own importance. They weren't excuses, they were barriers. The safety concerns weren't about protecting me from forklifts. They were about protecting their scheme from my eyes. They were preventing me from walking the yard and seeing Darla's luxury sedan parked next to a line of cargo vans, from noticing that the license plate on my father's weekend SUV didn't match the one in the official fleet registry. They had built a firewall of plausible deniability around their fraud, and I had been on the other side of it all along, meticulously auditing the data they allowed me to see. I leaned back in my chair. the glow of the monitor illuminating the dark room. The pieces were all on the board: the gift, the invoice, the VIN, the ghost company, the PO, box, the ownership records, the digital signature, the systemic loophole. It was a perfect, self-contained ecosystem of deceit, funded by Kingsley and Bray and orchestrated by my own family. I opened a physical notebook, the kind with crisp, grid-lined paper. The act of writing it down by hand made it feel more real, more permanent. I listed each piece of evidence, each data point, each connection. The pen moved quickly, my handwriting sharp and precise. They thought the truck was the end of my story. They were wrong. It was the beginning of theirs, and I was the one holding the pen. The clock on my monitor read 11:40 p.m. The city was asleep. I was not. My apartment was a cavern of darkness, pierced by the cold, blue-white light of the screen. The only sound was the soft click-clack of my keyboard, a steady, rhythmic pulse in the silence, a heartbeat. My login credentials for the Kingsley and Bray vendor management system were still active. A ghost access. The official notice of my termination wouldn't be processed until Monday morning. An oversight, a fatal one. They had given me a weekend. I navigated to the administrative backend, a part of the system few people ever saw. It was a landscape of raw data, of logs and access records. The truth lived here, unvarnished by corporate gloss. I started with the electronic data interchange gateway, the digital doorway through which our contractors submitted their official documents. I filtered the logs by user, by company: Stonecross Freight, user ID, C. Whitlow. The screen refreshed. A list of uploads appeared, time-stamped. Most were standard shipping manifests and driver certifications. But one file, uploaded 3 months ago at 2:13 a.m., stood out: Fleet Maint Amend Q3.pdf. A third-quarter amendment to the fleet maintenance contract. I downloaded it, opened it. It was a minor addendum, authorizing Stonecross to use pre-approved secondary maintenance providers for non-critical repairs to increase efficiency and reduce vehicle downtime. It was co-signed by Cole and a mid-level manager at Kingsley and Bray, who I knew reported to a director my father played golf with. The justification was plausible. The execution was the crime. This amendment was the key that opened the door. Now I needed to see what they had walked through it. My next stop was the accounts payable module. I didn't search for invoices. I searched for the rules that governed them. Deep in the system's logic, I found it: a new auto-approval protocol, implemented the day after the amendment was signed. If invoice vendor type equals secondary maintenance and invoice amount $15,000, then status equals approved. $15,000, just below the threshold that would require a senior manager's review. It was a common enough efficiency rule in a company our size. We processed thousands of invoices a day, but this one had been specifically tailored. It was a backdoor, installed in plain sight, disguised as a time saver. Now I searched for the invoices. Vendor: Northline Fleet Services. Time frame: last 6 months. The system took a moment to process. The progress bar filled. Then the results populated the screen, a cascade of data that made my breath catch. 127 invoices, 127 separate payments. The amounts varied: $12,500, $14,850, $13,275. All meticulously calculated to fly under the radar, all automatically approved and paid. The descriptions of the work performed were masterpieces of corporate vagueness: preventative sensor calibrations, system pressure diagnostics, fluid level adjustments. They were ghost services, impossible to verify after the fact. 127 transactions, over $1.7 million paid to Darla Whitlow's PNO box. This was the core of the fraud. But I needed more. I needed to prove not just that the invoices were suspicious, but that the work never happened. Every truck in the Stonecross fleet, as per our contract, was fitted with a GPS transponder that reported its position and engine status every 5 minutes. The data was our insurance against theft and a tool for route optimization. For me, it was now a time machine. I began the tedious, methodical work of cross-referencing. On one half of my screen, I had Northline's invoices, each with a date, a truck number, and a service time. On the other half, I had the GPS portal. Invoice 74, Truck 508, service date, August 12th. Service time, 2:00 p.m. I keyed the truck number and date into the GPS history. The map loaded, a breadcrumb trail of blue dots showing the truck's movement. At 2:00 p.m. on August 12th, Truck 508 was not in a maintenance bay. It was stationary in the parking lot of the Riverton, the steakhouse where Stonecross executives held their long lunches. The engine was off. It sat there for 3 hours. Invoice 81, Truck 612, service date, August 28th. Emergency hydraulic check, 11:00 a.m. The GPS showed the truck idling in the parking lot of the Hallow Creek Mall. Invoice 97, Truck 551, service date, September 15th. Full diagnostic sweep. 4:30 p.m. The truck was parked on Candle Row, right in front of my father's house. I worked through the night, the clicks of my mouse a frantic, steady rhythm. Of the 127 invoices, I found GPS evidence for 32 of them that placed the trucks miles away from any legitimate service location during the build maintenance window. It was irrefutable. The work was a fiction. One final piece. I needed to show that not only were the trucks not in the shop, but the mechanics weren't either. I still had a back-channel login to Stonecross's HR and payroll system, a relic from the initial integration when they became our primary carrier. I had set it up myself, another oversight. I pulled the weekly timesheets for their maintenance staff. I cross-referenced the names and dates with the Northline invoices. The results were exactly as I expected. For the repair on Truck 508, the lead mechanic was clocked out, on vacation. For the hydraulic check on Truck 612, the entire service bay staff was in a mandatory safety meeting. The phantom services were performed by phantom mechanics. It was all here, a complete, interlocking narrative of fraud. From conception to execution to payout. The contract amendment that created the opportunity. The rule change that enabled the automation. The invoices that billed for the ghost work. The GPS data that proved the lie. The timesheets that confirmed the conspiracy. My hands flew across the keyboard. Export, save, collate. I pulled every log, every invoice, every GPS plot, every timesheet. I compiled them into a single, master anomaly report, my own notes in the margins marking the connections, the flow of money, the chain of command. I created a timeline, from the incorporation of Northline to the final invoice paid last Friday. Each file was digitally timestamped by the system as I accessed it, creating a new, secondary record of my investigation. I connected a small, black external hard drive to my laptop, a cold storage drive, offline, unhackable. I dragged the master file over, the progress bar filling slowly. It felt like I was transferring the weight of my family's sins onto a piece of silicon. The drive clicked, the transfer complete. I ejected it, the small device heavy in my palm. But a digital file wasn't enough. I needed something physical, something with a federally recognized timestamp. I printed a single-page summary of my findings, a condensed version of the timeline and the most damning evidence. I folded it, slid it into a standard business envelope, and sealed it. I addressed it to myself, at my own apartment. I walked out into the pre-dawn chill. The streets empty and silent. I found a blue postal service mailbox a few blocks away. The metal was cold and damp under my fingers. I paused for a moment, the white envelope in my hand. This was the final step, the point of no return. I wasn't the accountant daughter anymore. I wasn't the one who worked in a clean, safe office. I was the person my father had trained me to be, the one who reads to the last line. Now, I was the auditor of a Category 5 hurricane, and it was spinning right over my family's home. He thought his speech at the restaurant was a declaration of power. He was wrong. It was a confession. I pushed the envelope through the slot, the soft thud as it landed inside the dark, metal box was the only sound in the world. My father had rung the bell, calling for the rain. I was about to answer with a flood. The conference room on the 14th floor was designed to make you feel small, a single, monolithic slab of polished mahogany stretched across its length, reflecting the gray morning sky like a dark, still lake. The chairs were high-backed black leather, and they sighed with an expensive sound when you sat. But they were stiff and unforgiving, built for alertness, not comfort. From this height, the town of Hallow Creek was a tidy, silent map of its own small ambitions. It was a room for pronouncements, for decisions made far away from the people they would affect. It was a room for executions. It was precisely 9 a.m. Across the table sat the trinity of my professional demise. Arthur Vance, the chief operating officer, a man whose silver hair was perfectly parted and whose smiles never reached his cold, calculating eyes. Beside him, Eleanor Shaw, the general counsel, a woman who wore her severity like a shield, her gaze constantly assessing, weighing, and judging, and finally, a junior HR director named Peterson, a man clearly out of his depth, his papers trembling slightly in his hands. He was here to be the sympathetic face, the procedural buffer. He was a prop. And at the far end of the table, slouched in his chair with a self-satisfied smirk, was my brother, Cole. He was wearing a new suit, one I knew he couldn't afford, the fabric just a little too shiny under the recessed lighting. He was observing the proceedings like a spectator at a game he had already bet on. "Nora, thank you for coming," Arthur began, his voice smooth and practiced. He gestured to the folder in front of me. "As you know, the market is in a state of flux. We're constantly evaluating our internal structures to maximize synergies and position ourselves for future growth." Corporate jargon, the sterile language of the abattoir. I said nothing. I simply watched him. "After a comprehensive review," he continued, "we've made the difficult decision to restructure the supply chain oversight division. Your role, unfortunately, has been identified as redundant in the new, more streamlined framework." Redundant. It was a perfect word. Cold, clinical, erasing years of work with a single, bloodless term. Peterson, the HR prop, cleared his throat and slid the folder a few inches closer to me. "This is your standard severance package. Nora, we feel it's quite generous. It includes 4 months' salary, continued health benefits, and outplacement services. All we require is your signature on the standard separation agreement." I opened the folder. My eyes scanned the dense paragraphs, the language I knew by heart. My gaze fell on the clause they wanted me to see. The words printed in a heavy, deliberate boldface. "The employee agrees to a mutual non-disparagement covenant and will not, in any forum, public or private, make statements that could be construed as detrimental to the business or reputation of Kingsley and Bray Logistics or its partners." A gag order. They weren't just firing me, they were buying my silence. From the end of the table, Cole shifted in his chair. Leaning forward, he caught my eye, the smirk widening into a tight, insincere smile. "Nothing personal, Nora," he said, his voice low, meant just for me, but it carried across the silent room. "It's just business." That was the cue. I closed the folder softly. The sound was a period at the end of their sentence. Then, from my briefcase, I withdrew a small black USB drive. It was unadorned, anonymous. I placed it in the center of the vast mahogany table. It looked tiny, insignificant. "I understand," I said, my voice even and calm. "As a final professional courtesy, I've prepared a parting gift." Arthur Vance's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. "It's a comprehensive review of our vendor compliance protocols," I explained, "specifically in relation to our primary freight contractor, Stonecross. I believe you'll find it illuminating." A flicker of something, annoyance, curiosity, crossed Arthur's face. He glanced at Eleanor. The general counsel's eyes narrowed. She had been watching me, silent and still, but now she leaned forward, her focus sharpening. She was the first to sense that the script had changed. Ms. Davis, Eleanor said to the junior executive assistant taking notes by the door. Please begin taking official minutes. Note that at 9:04 a.m., Ms. Whitlow has presented the company with what she is classifying as compliance-related materials. She looked at me. We accept your submission. Nora. The air in the room grew colder, thinner. This was no longer an HR meeting. It was a legal proceeding. I reached into my briefcase again. This time, I pulled out the sealed envelope I had mailed to myself. The official U.S. Postal Service postmark was clearly visible. Dated last Friday, I slid it across the polished surface of the table. It stopped next to the USB drive. This is a hard copy summary of the initial findings, I said. As you can see, the postmark confirms the date of receipt by a third party. The chain of custody is secure and documented. Chain of custody, 2 words that transformed an envelope into a threat. 2 words that told them I was not a disgruntled employee. I was a plaintiff building a case. Peterson, the HR director, blanched. He looked from the envelope to Eleanor, his composure finally cracking. Are you threatening the company? Ms. Whitlow? He stammered. I turned my gaze to him. It was a quiet, level look. There was no anger in my voice, only a profound and weary finality. No, Mr. Peterson, I said. I'm doing my job, one last time. A heavy silence descended. Cole's smirk was gone, replaced by a look of baffled confusion. He was a blunt instrument, and he did not understand the language of scalpels. Arthur Vance stared at the USB drive, his mind clearly racing, reassessing. But Eleanor Shaw's eyes were locked on mine. In them, I saw a glimmer of something that looked almost like professional respect. She knew exactly what was happening. She was a lawyer, and she recognized a well-prepared adversary when she saw one. I pulled the severance agreement back in front of me. I uncapped my pen, the click echoing in the stillness. I signed my name on the indicated line, my signature clean and steady. I had no intention of contesting my termination. That was their move, in their game. I was playing a different one entirely. I slid the signed document back to Peterson. I'll take my copy of the agreement, I said, and a copy of the minutes from this meeting. Eleanor nodded to her assistant. A few moments later, 2 sets of paper were placed before me. I folded them neatly and put them in my briefcase. I stood up, the leather chair sighing behind me. I did not look at my brother. I did not look at Arthur Vance. I looked only at Eleanor Shaw. Thank you for your time, I said. Then I turned and walked out of the room, my heels clicking a steady, even rhythm on the marble floor of the hallway. I did not look back. The elevator ride down was silent. I felt a strange sense of calm. The quiet that comes after a storm has been unleashed. I walked through the gleaming, impersonal lobby, past the security desk, and out into the cool morning air. On the sidewalk, I paused. I pulled out my phone. My fingers were steady as I navigated to my contacts. I found the number I had memorized years ago. The direct line for a man I'd met at a federal compliance seminar. A man who took his job very, very seriously. I typed a short, simple message. David, I have a report for you. Potential Title 49 violations. Substantial. Documented carrier fraud. Let me know when you have a moment. N. Whitlow. I hit send. The message disappeared from my screen. It wasn't revenge. It was risk management. It was a report. The celebratory dinner was being held in the Rosewood Ballroom at the Alder and Finch, the kind of place that smells of beeswax and old money. The room was a soft-focused dream of candlelight and clinking crystal. Men in dark suits and women in jewel-toned dresses laughed in low, confident murmurs. This was a victory party, thrown by Stonecross Freight to celebrate the strategic expansion of their partnership with Kingsley and Bray. It was a party to celebrate my erasure. I watched from the arched doorway for a moment before entering. My father, Graham Whitlow, stood near the head of the main table. The guest of honor, the king in his court. He was wearing a new watch, a gleaming silver chronograph that caught the light as he gesticulated. He was in the middle of a story, his voice carrying across the room, full of false modesty and genuine arrogance. And, at the end of the day, you have to cut the dead weight. He was saying to a rapt audience that included several senior managers from Kingsley and Bray. The parts of the machine that consume resources without producing results. It was a tough call for them, I'm sure, but a necessary one. We're leaner now, more efficient. We're saving the company from its own wastefulness. He was talking about me. He was framing my termination as a cost-saving measure he had personally championed. He was taking credit for my demise. A few feet away, Darla was holding court with a different circle. She was radiant, triumphant. "Oh, Northline?" she said, her voice a tinkling laugh in response to a question. "It's just a little something I started, a way to help out the local service community. You know, we provide flexible, on-demand support for our wonderful haulers. Graham is so supportive. He always says it's important to give back. A small service to help the community." My stomach tightened into a cold knot. The audacity was breathtaking. I had dressed deliberately for the occasion, a simple, severe black dress, no jewelry. I was not here to celebrate. I was here to close an account. I walked into the room. The conversations closest to me faltered as heads turned. I was the ghost at the feast, the redundant employee who was supposed to have disappeared quietly. I ignored the stares and walked directly to the main table. My father saw me approach, and a flicker of irritation crossed his face before he masked it with a wide, paternal smile. "Nora, so glad you could make it. We were just toasting to a brighter future." "I heard," I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the nearby chatter. I didn't smile back. I reached into my purse and took out the key fob for the North Star Titan 2500. I placed it on the crisp white tablecloth, directly in front of his plate. The silver logo gleamed under the candlelight. "Happy birthday, Dad. I don't believe we finished our conversation about your gift." A tense silence fell over the table. Graham's smile tightened. Darla's eyes narrowed. Cole, ever the loyal fool, tried to play the peacemaker, the enforcer of the family code of silence. He laughed nervously. "Hey, come on. Nora, let's not bring work to the dinner table, huh?" "This isn't work, Cole," I said, my gaze locked on my father. "It's an invoice." I took a small, portable Pico projector from my purse and set it on the table. With a few taps on my phone, it whirred to life, casting a bright, rectangular image on the blank cream-colored wall behind my father's head. The entire room turned to look. The first image was a crisp, high-resolution scan of the sales invoice from Blackridge Motors. I had used a simple presentation app, highlighting the key lines in red. "Exhibit A," I said, my voice as clear and dispassionate as if I were in a boardroom. "One North Star Titan 2500, paid in full. The buyer of record, as you can see, is Nora Whitlow." I swiped my thumb across my phone's screen. A new image appeared. It was a close-up of the invoice's discount section. "Exhibit B, a corporate fleet rebate in the amount of $12,000, issued not to Stonecross Freight, but to an entity called Northline Fleet Services." A murmur went through the room. My father's face had gone rigid, the festive color draining from it. Darla looked as if she had been slapped. "I was curious about Northline," I continued, my voice a calm, steady narrative over the projected evidence. "They aren't an approved Kingsley and Bray partner, so I looked them up." Swipe. The next image was a screenshot of the state's LLC registration filing. The owner was clearly listed, Darla Whitlow, 100% beneficial interest. A gasp came from someone at the table. "A community service," I said, my eyes still on my father. "That seems to have a very specific community of one." Swipe. The final image. It was a screenshot from the Stonecross Fleet Management portal, the audit log for the bulk vehicle purchase. It showed the user ID, the timestamp, and the action. The digital approval that bundled the Titan into the fleet and directed the rebate to Northline. The user ID was C. Whitlow. The digital signature was a clean, undeniable CWW. "And Exhibit D," I said, "the internal approval for the transaction, signed by Cole Whitlow, under the title Special projects. The silence in the ballroom was now absolute. It was a physical weight, pressing down on all of us. No one was eating, no one was drinking. Every eye was on the wall, then on my father, whose face was a mask of disbelief and fury. Then, a voice from the other end of the table, panicked and sharp. It was a mid-level finance manager from Kingsley and Bray, a man I knew slightly. He was staring at the wall, his face pale. "That rebate," he said, almost to himself, but his voice carried in the stillness. "That amount, it's outside the approved framework for a third-party redirection. It would have needed executive sign-off." He had just, in front of the entire room, publicly confirmed the fraud. At that exact moment, a phone began to ring. It was a sharp, insistent, modern tone that shattered the old-world elegance of the room. Every head turned. Arthur Vance, the COO of Kingsley and Bray, was staring at his phone on the table as if it were a venomous snake. He had been trying to remain a detached observer, but now he was the center of attention. He glanced at my father, a look of pure ice in his eyes, and answered the call, putting it on speaker by mistake in his haste. "Vance here," he barked. A man's voice, crisp and official, came through the phone's small speaker. "Mr. Vance, this is David Miller, Regional Inspector with the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. I do apologize for the late call. I'm just confirming that, pursuant to a formal report I received this morning. My team and I will be at the Stonecross Freight Depot tomorrow morning at 0800 hours for a full, unannounced audit of their fleet maintenance logs and vehicle rosters. I trust we'll have your full cooperation." A collective intake of breath swept through the room. An FMCSA raid. It was the corporate death penalty. Arthur Vance fumbled with the phone, killing the speaker. He stood up, his face ashen, and walked away from the table without a word. The party was over. I looked at my father. His hands were flat on the table, his knuckles white. He was staring at the key fob as if it were the weapon that had killed him. Darla was crying silently, her perfect makeup beginning to run. Cole just looked lost, a child watching his world burn down, not understanding why. I leaned forward, my voice a whisper meant only for him, a final, quiet closing statement. "You taught me to read to the last line, Dad." I stood up, leaving the projector running, the evidence of their crimes glowing on the wall for all to see. I turned and walked away, leaving the key, the invoice, and the wreckage of their lives behind me on the table. Dawn broke over the Stonecross Freight Depot with a cold, industrial gray. The air tasted of diesel and damp asphalt. By the time the first shift of drivers arrived, their faces drawn and sleep-creased, the audit was already underway. David Miller and his team from the FMCSA didn't move like police conducting a raid. They moved with the quiet, unnerving efficiency of surgeons. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confrontations. There was just the relentless, methodical process of verification. Miller, a man with a calm demeanor that belied a mind like a steel trap, had requested the manifest for the most recent fleet rebate program. A panicked yard manager, my father's man, had produced it, his hands trembling slightly as he handed over the tablet. Miller's team didn't need to hunt. They already had my map. They selected 15 vehicle numbers from the list, seemingly at random, and began their work. The first truck they examined was a late-model hauler, its massive chrome grille beaded with morning dew. One of Miller's inspectors, a young woman with sharp, intelligent eyes, popped open the cab's diagnostic port cover and plugged in her federal issue scanner. The screen glowed green. "All systems nominal," she reported. "Last log service, 4 days ago, full sensor calibration." Miller nodded, then gestured to the engine block. "Let's take a look." Under the massive hood, the engine was a labyrinth of hoses and wires, but the inspector wasn't looking at the main components. Her gloved fingers traced a thin wire to a small, sealed sensor on the fuel injection manifold. She shone a pen light on it. A tiny, unbroken dab of blue factory paint sealed the connection point. It had never been touched. "Seals intact, sir," she said. She checked another, and another. All bore the manufacturer's original seals. The full sensor calibration was a digital ghost. Following the wire back to the cab, she found it. A small, illegal OBD spoofer. A simple plug-in device designed to broadcast a pre-recorded loop of healthy diagnostic data. It was the electronic equivalent of stuffing a sock in a rattling engine. They found 2 more identical devices on 2 other trucks within the hour. Meanwhile, another inspector was running VINs against license plates. His tablet connected to the national DMV database. A flag appeared on his screen. Truck 417, a standard flatbed, was listed on the manifest with plate number 7B4K29. The DMV record confirmed the plate was registered to that VN, but a secondary search in the state's traffic enforcement database flagged the same plate. An hour ago, a camera had ticketed a white luxury sedan for an illegal U-turn on the other side of town. The plate was 7B4K29. The inspector requested Stonecross's gate security logs. He pulled the footage from the previous week, cross-referencing it with the GPS data I had provided. There it was, displayed on his screen in a split image. Truck 417 entering the Stonecross depot on Tuesday, and Darla's white sedan, bearing the exact same license plate, leaving my father's gated community on Wednesday. It was brazen, simple, and utterly illegal. They were cloning plates to pass off her personal vehicle as a commercial asset. By 9 a.m., Miller dispatched 2 agents to the address listed for Northline Fleet Services. It wasn't a garage. It wasn't a workshop. It was Unit 14 in a desolate strip of rental warehouses on the industrial edge of town. The metal roll-up door was secured with a cheap padlock. After getting the property owner to open it, they found what they expected to find. Nothing. The concrete floor was clean, unstained by a single drop of oil or grease. There were no tools, no hydraulic lifts, no machinery, just a dusty folding table, a single chair, and a box of invoices, pre-signed by Darla Whitlow. The service descriptions left conveniently blank. It was a phantom shop, a POCO box with a roof, created for the sole purpose of generating fraudulent paperwork. The preliminary report was written in the back of a government vehicle in the Stonecross parking lot, a mobile command center in the heart of my father's crumbling empire. The language was precise, damning, and stripped of all emotion. It spoke of a coordinated conspiracy to commit maintenance fraud, systematic falsification of fleet records for the purpose of defrauding a federal fuel rebate program, and multiple instances of undisclosed self-dealing and conflict of interest involving a shell corporation, Northline Fleet Services, and senior Stonecross management. At 10:15 a.m., a digitally signed copy of that report was emailed to Arthur Vance and Eleanor Shaw at Kingsley and Bray. The corporate response was instantaneous and brutal. At 10:22 a.m., Eleanor Shaw invoked Clause 17.4 of the Master Service Agreement, the suspension for cause provision, citing gross negligence and fraudulent activity. A second email, sent from the Finance Department at 10:24 a.m., informed Stonecross that all pending and future payments were frozen, effective immediately. The flow of money, the lifeblood of my father's company, was cut off. At 10:28 a.m., a company-wide internal memo was dispatched at Kingsley and Bray, its subject line stark. Urgent, emergency meeting of the Board of Directors. It was scheduled for 5:00 p.m. that afternoon. The agenda contained a single item: review and termination of the Stonecross freight contract. I was at home, watching the digital fallout from a safe distance, when my phone began to buzz. The screen lit up with Darla's name. I ignored it. It buzzed again, and again, a frantic, desperate rhythm. I watched the call notifications stack up on my screen. 1, 2, 5, 10, 17 missed calls in the space of 5 minutes. I pressed the power button and held it, watching as the screen went black. The silence was a relief. Then, a minute later, a new notification appeared on my powered-down screen's lock display, a voicemail icon. The number was my father's. I put the phone to my ear. I didn't have to guess what it would be. His voice, when it came, was not the booming, confident baritone of the patriarch or the COO. It was a voice I had never heard before. It was thin, ragged, and stripped of all its authority. It was the voice of a man watching his world burn to the ground. "Nora," he pleaded, his breath catching in a sob. "Nora, please, call me. Don't do this." I listened to the message twice. Then, with a steady hand, I connected my phone to my laptop. I navigated to the voicemail file. I didn't delete it. I didn't reply. I dragged the audio file into the secure folder on my cold storage drive, alongside the invoices, the GPS logs, and the corporate filings. I renamed the file, my typing precise and even. Evidence Voicemail G-Wave. It was just another piece of data in the audit, a final, verifiable record of his surrender. The boardroom at 5 p.m. was a different world from the one I had been unceremoniously fired in. The morning's mahogany table had been replaced by a massive U-shaped configuration of pale, sterile maple. The air was frigid, the climate control working overtime to combat the tension. The full board of directors was present, a collection of solemn, grim-faced men and women who represented the real power at Kingsley and Bray. On a large screen at the head of the room, 2 more faces looked on. The company's external legal counsel from a high-powered firm in the city, their expressions unreadable. My father and Cole were there, but they were not seated at the main table. They sat in 2 smaller, isolated chairs against the wall, like defendants in a courtroom. My father's face was a stony, gray mask. Cole just stared at his hands, his expensive new suit looking cheap and ill-fitting under the harsh fluorescent lights. I was seated at the curve of the U next to Eleanor Shaw. I was not an employee. I was not a victim. I was a witness. There were no pleasantries. The chairman of the board, a formidable man named Marcus Thorne, began with a voice like stones grinding together. "This meeting is to review the findings of an internal audit and the preliminary report from the FMCSA concerning our contract with Stonecross Freight. Ms. Whitlow, you may begin." I didn't stand. I simply tapped the screen of the tablet in front of me. The large monitor at the front of the room, previously showing the remote lawyers, flickered to life. It now displayed my desktop. The core of the fraud was facilitated by an automated payment system. I began, my voice even, my tone informational. I was delivering a report, nothing more. The system was designed to auto-approve maintenance invoices under $15,000. The perpetrators exploited this. I clicked a file. A screen recording began to play, silent and damning. It showed a user logging into the Stonecross invoicing portal. The timestamp in the corner read 2:13 a.m. The user ID was C. Whitlow. The video showed my brother's cursor moving with a clumsy speed, opening a spreadsheet of 20 large maintenance jobs, one by one. He broke them down, splitting a single $80,000 job into 6 smaller, fraudulent invoices, each one just under the $15,000 threshold. He copied and pasted vague service descriptions, assigned them to different truck numbers, and submitted them. The entire process took less than 10 minutes. This footage shows over $100,000 in fraudulent charges being submitted in a single night, I stated. The purpose was to circumvent senior approval protocols. I closed the video file and opened another folder. The scheme required a willing partner. The designated secondary maintenance provider was a company called Northline Fleet Services. I clicked again, and a chain of emails appeared on the screen. The relevant passages highlighted. They were from my father's official Stonecross account to various mid-level managers at Kingsley and Bray. His language was carefully chosen. I'd like to encourage you to utilize Northline for any overflow work. They offer a level of community flexibility our larger partners can't. A great local option to keep things moving. Here, Graham Whitlow uses his position as COO of our primary contractor to encourage the use of an unvetted, unknown third-party vendor. I narrated. He is, in effect, creating the demand for the fraudulent services Cole Whitlow is invoicing for. I switched the display. A satellite image filled the screen. a bird's-eye view of a desolate warehouse with a faded roof, a red pin marked Unit 14. This is the registered address for Northline's service depot. As you can see from the image, dated last week, the grass in the parking lot is knee-high. The service bay door shows significant rust and has not been opened in what appears to be a very long time. The final click. It was a flowchart, a simple, brutal visualization of the money trail. It showed payments from Kingsley and Bray to Northline Fleet Services. From Northline, the chart showed a series of transfers to a single bank account. I projected a redacted bank statement, the name of the account holder clearly visible, Darla Whitlow. A second branch on the flowchart showed 4 subsequent transfers, each over $100,000, moving from Darla's account to another. The name of this account was the Whitlow Family Trust. I turned off the projector. The screen went black. The room was utterly silent. I folded my hands on the table. To summarize, I said, looking directly at Marcus Thorne, this was a coordinated effort involving self-dealing, using a shell corporation owned by a family member to receive fraudulent payments. It involved the deliberate concealment of financial approvals and the personal enrichment of senior Stonecross management from funds directly tied to their Kingsley and Bray contract. The legal part of the meeting began. One of the lawyers on the screen, a man with a sharp, angular face, addressed my father directly. His voice was devoid of emotion. Mr. Whitlow, for the record, I ask you one question. Do you have, or have you ever had, any personal or financial relationship with the entity known as Northline Fleet Services? This was his moment, his chance to lie, to deny, to fight. The entire room waited. My father did not speak. His eyes were fixed on the glass of ice water that sat on the small table beside his chair. His hand, which had been resting on his knee, moved to the glass, his fingers wrapped around it. His knuckles went white. He stared at the glass as if it contained the answer to the question. And then it happened. A sound, not loud, but sharp, crystalline, and utterly distinct in the dead silence of the room. A single, sharp tick. A tiny, star-shaped fracture had appeared in the side of the glass, a web of fine, silver lines spreading from the pressure point of his thumb. The sound, small as it was an echo of a man breaking. It was the sound of a confession, made without a single word. Marcus Thorne had seen it. He picked up a pen and a single sheet of paper. He wrote a few lines, his movements decisive. He pushed the paper toward Eleanor Shaw, who reviewed it and gave a single, sharp nod. The chairman signed it with a flourish. Effective immediately, Thorne announced, his voice a gavel. Graham Whitlow and Cole Whitlow are suspended from all duties related to the Kingsley and Bray contract. Our agreement with Stonecross Freight is terminated, pending the results of a full forensic audit and federal investigation. Eleanor, you will forward our entire file, including the materials provided by Ms. Whitlow and the minutes of this meeting, to the U.S. Attorney's Office and the FMCSA by end of business today. His pronouncement was a series of nails being hammered into a coffin. I didn't look at my father's face. I didn't want to see the defeat, the despair, the hatred that would be directed at me. My gaze remained fixed on the small table beside him. I just watched the tiny, silver crack in the glass, a perfect, flawed star in a universe of ice and water, a system that had broken under a pressure it could no longer contain. The chairman's words hung in the frozen air of the boardroom, each one a final, unappealable judgment. My father seemed to shrink in his chair, the life force draining out of him, leaving behind a hollow shell of the titan who had commanded rooms just like this one. Cole stared at the black, lifeless screen where my evidence had been displayed, his face a mask of slack-jawed incomprehension. The machine had been stopped, the verdict rendered. But there was one last piece of business to conclude, one final asset to be liquidated. With a slow, deliberate movement, I reached into my briefcase. My fingers closed around the familiar solid shape of the key fob for the North Star Titan 2500. I placed it on the pale maple table in front of me. It lay there, small and black with its silver logo, a stark contrast to the sea of official documents. It was the inciting incident, the catalyst, the gift that had become a weapon. I directed my words to Marcus Thorne, but my gaze swept across the entire board. "There is the matter of the truck," I said, my voice cutting through the funereal silence. "As it was purchased in conjunction with a fraudulent corporate rebate, it is legally considered proceeds of that fraud. As such, it is an asset that must be returned." On the large screen, the lead external counsel, the man with the angular face, nodded almost imperceptibly. "We've already been in contact with the dealership's legal department," he stated, his voice a dry rustle of paper. "They have agreed to a full buyback of the vehicle, pending its immediate surrender. It will be held as material evidence in their own case against Northline Fleet Services regarding the fraudulent rebate claim." The circle was closing. Every loose thread was being tied into a neat legal knot. I picked up the key fob. I did not give it to the chairman. Instead, I stood, walked the few steps to where my father sat, and looked down at him. He wouldn't meet my eyes. His gaze was fixed on the fractured glass of water, as if his entire world had been reduced to that single, broken object. "I'm not taking back the money, Dad," I said, my voice low, for him alone. "I'm taking back the truth." He flinched as if I had struck him. His mouth opened, a dry, rasping sound emerging, but no words followed. He closed it again, defeated. The silence was his only answer. A commotion near the boardroom door drew a few glances. A security guard was speaking in low tones to Darla, who must have been waiting in the hall. Her face was a mess of tears and disbelief, her voice a rising, hysterical whisper that was quickly and professionally steered down the corridor. Cole, however, finally found his voice. He shot to his feet, his face red with a child's helpless rage. He pointed a trembling finger at the key fob in my hand. "Are you serious?" he spat, his voice cracking. "All of this? You burned everything to the ground for a stupid truck?" I turned to face him, my expression unreadable. I felt nothing, no anger, no pity. He was a variable in an equation that had now been solved. "No, Cole," I said, my voice flat and final. "It was never about this truck. It was for all the other ones. The ones you signed for in the middle of the night, the ones Darla drove to the mall, the ones that paid for your suits and my father's watch. This truck just happened to be the one with the receipt." He stared at me, his mind unable to process the logic, the scale of it all. He saw a family argument. I saw a racketeering case. "Thank you, Nora," Marcus Thorne said, his voice pulling my attention back to the table. He looked at me, his expression stern, but his eyes held a flicker of something else, approval. "Your integrity in this matter was not timely," he said, a master of the corporate understatement. "But it was principled, and in the end, that is what this company values." He gestured to the HR director, Peterson, who still looked shell-shocked. "Peterson, the separation agreement with Ms. Whitlow is null and void. Please tear it up." Peterson fumbled with the folder, his hands clumsy. He pulled out the document I had signed that morning and, with a visible sense of relief, ripped it in half, then in half again. The sound of tearing paper was loud in the silent room. Thorne continued, his gaze still fixed on me. "The board has just held an impromptu vote. We are creating a new position, effective immediately, Director of Integrity and Controls. It will be an independent role, reporting directly to this board. The job is to ensure that something like this can never happen again. The position is yours, should you choose to accept it." The offer hung in the air, vindication, a promotion, a restoration. My father made a choking sound, but no one looked at him. All eyes were on me. I didn't answer right away. I didn't look at the chairman or the board members. I didn't nod or smile. My work wasn't quite finished. I turned my back on them all and walked to the vast, floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the city and the sprawling parking lot 14 stories below. I could just make out the celestial silver of the North Star Titan, gleaming even in the flat, gray light of the late afternoon. I raised the key fob. I pressed the lock button. 14 floors down. A tiny flash of lights blinked once. A moment later, the sound reached the insulated glass of the boardroom, faint but distinct, a single, sharp, electronic beep. The final word, the period at the end of the last sentence, the closing of the file. A strange and profound quiet settled over me. It wasn't the giddy rush of victory. It wasn't the bitter satisfaction of revenge. It was something deeper, something more peaceful. It was silence. It was the feeling of a machine that has been rattling and grinding and vibrating with a deep, structural flaw for years, and has, at long last, simply been turned off. The shuddering stops, the noise ceases, and all that is left is a sudden, welcome, and absolute stillness. I turned from the window, the faint echo of the car alarm's beep still hanging in the air like the last note of a song. The quiet in the boardroom was no longer tense. It was hollowed out, an empty space where a storm had just been. All eyes were on me, waiting for my answer, for my acceptance, for the next chapter. But there was no next chapter. There was only the closing of this one. I walked back to the table, my footsteps the only sound. I ignored the proffered job title, the looks of expectation. Instead, I picked up the fresh glass of ice water that had been placed at my seat. The glass was cool, solid, and unflawed. I held it up, not in a grand gesture, but in a small, contained motion. The light caught the ice inside, fracturing into 1,000 tiny rainbows. I looked at no one in particular. My voice not a proclamation, but a quiet, final statement of fact. To families, I said, the words falling into the silence. Who read to the last line? There was no answering toast. No one moved. But across the U-shaped table, I saw 2 of the older board members give a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was an acknowledgement, a sign of respect between people who understood the sanctity of a contract. I placed the glass down gently. Eleanor Shaw pushed a single sheet of paper toward me, along with the sealed envelope I had brought. The paper was a legal attestation, a formal document stating that the evidence contained in the envelope had been opened, reviewed, and entered into the official minutes of the meeting. I took my pen, uncapped it, and signed my name. My signature was the final stamp of verification on my own work. As if on cue, the heavy doors to the boardroom swung open. A draft of cold air from the hallway swirled in, carrying with it the clean, sterile scent of freshly printed paper from a nearby copy room. It was the smell of business, of ledgers and reports, the smell of a clean slate. There were no handshakes, there were no embraces, there were certainly no apologies. There was only the rustle of paper, the quiet click of a briefcase latch, the finality of signatures and red-inked corporate seals. My business here was concluded. I stood and gathered my things, my movements unhurried. I left the key fob to the North Star Titan sitting in the middle of the table, a solitary black island on the pale maple. It was evidence. It was a rebate. It was the most honest birthday present I had ever given my father. I walked toward the open doors, past the members of the board, past Eleanor Shaw, past the empty chairs where my father and brother had sat. I didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. In the hallway, the world was quiet. The elevator arrived with a soft chime as the doors slid shut, sealing me in the small, silent box. I took out my phone one last time. I opened a new message. I typed in my father's number. My fingers were steady. The message was short. The final entry in a logbook that was now closed forever. You taught me to read to the last line. I did. I hit send. I watched the screen as the message was delivered. Then, I let the phone go dark. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I'd love to know your thoughts, and if you feel comfortable sharing, comment below with where in the world you're listening from. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving this video a like, and hitting that hype button to help it reach more listeners. Your support means the world.